She was 19 years old, penniless, and standing in the road with everything she owned wrapped in a flour sack. Her uncle, Ezra Pruitt, had told her plainly that a grown woman was a burden he could no longer carry, and he had pressed $9 into her palm, as if that settled a debt owed to the dead. With 3 of those dollars still in her pocket weeks later, she would claim a ranch nobody wanted. A ruin of collapsed fences and silence on the edge of the Wyoming grasslands. Given to her for nothing because the land office could not imagine anyone foolish enough to want it. They called it cursed. They called it dry. What they did not know, what had been sealed away in the stones of an old well for 11 long years, was a secret that would not only change the shape of her life, but would restore water and justice to an entire valley that had forgotten what either one felt like. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh, if you have ever found yourself standing at the edge of something broken, wondering whether it was worth saving. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And stay with us until the end. Adeline Marsh had been raised in the small river town of Millbrook Hollow, Missouri, in a narrow clapboard house that smelled always of cedar shavings and lamp oil. Her father, Thomas Marsh, was a stonemason and a well digger. A broad, quiet man whose hands were permanently stained the color of river clay, and whose reputation stretched 2 counties wide for his particular gift. Folks called him a water witch, though he never claimed to be anything more than observant. He could walk a stretch of dry pasture, kneel, press his palm flat against the earth, and tell a farmer within 20 feet where the water ran beneath the surface, and how deep a man would have to dig to find it sweet and cold instead of bitter and thin. Adeline's mother, Ruth, was a seamstress with a laugh like a struck bell, a woman who mended the town's Sunday dresses and in her quieter hours taught her only daughter to read from a worn family Bible and a battered almanac, tracing the letters with a fingertip across the page until they came alive. From her father, Adeline learned the language of stone and water long before she understood why it mattered. She learned to read the color of soil, to know the difference between a clay that would hold a well's walls firm and a sandy loam that would collapse under its own weight without careful bracing. She learned to lay dry stone the way her father laid it, choosing each piece not for its shape alone, but for how it would rest against its neighbors, distributing weight so that a wall or a well lining could stand 100 years without a drop of mortar. She learned the patience of it, the way a well was not dug so much as coaxed into being, a slow negotiation with the earth that could not be rushed without inviting disaster. "Where's the water, Addie?" her father would ask her, testing her, and she would kneel in the grass beside him, feel for the faint coolness that sometimes rose from deep ground on a still morning, and guess. More often than not, by the time she was 12, she guessed right. It was a gift and a burden both, this quiet knowledge, because it set her apart from the other girls in Millbrook Hollow, who spent their afternoons at needlework and gossip while Adeline trailed her father to job sites with a canteen and a notebook, recording depths and soil types in a careful hand. She did not mind being different. She had her father's calm and her mother's warmth, and for 15 years that combination had been enough to make her happy in a modest, unremarkable way. Then the fever came through the valley in the autumn Adeline turned 15. The kind that swept along the river towns every few years and took the very old and the very young with terrible indifference. And it took her mother in 11 days. Her father did not weep where anyone could see him, but something in him went quiet after that, a quiet that never fully lifted. He kept working, because a man with a trade must work. But the well jobs took him further from home, into rougher country, chasing contracts because the money was better and because Adeline suspected. The distance let him grieve without an audience, she remembered. 2. The particular ritual of those years before her mother died. The 3 of them at the supper table with the shutters open to let in the cool evening air off the river. Her father telling small dry stories about the day's digging. her mother laughing in that bell-clear way of hers, even when the stories were not especially funny. Simply because laughter was the language the two of them had always spoken to each other in. Adeline understood, even as a girl, that she had been given something rare in that household. A home built on steadiness rather than spectacle. And she carried the memory of it the way another woman might carry a locket, taking it out in her mind whenever the world afterward grew hard enough to require it. 2 years later, on a job outside a settlement called Piney Fork, a wall he was lining gave way before the bracing could be set, and Thomas Marsh was buried under a collapse of stone and clay he himself had chosen. He was found the next morning by the men who had hired him. Adeline was 17, and in the space of 2 years she had lost both of her parents to a country that seemed to take without explanation and without apology. She went, as was proper and expected, into the household of her father's only living relative, her uncle Ezra Pruitt, a grain merchant in the same town, a man of tight ledgers and tighter opinions, who took her in not out of affection, but out of the obligation that kin owed kin. An obligation he clearly regarded as a tax rather than a kindness. For 2 years, Adeline lived in the attic room of her uncle's house above the granary, a narrow space with a slanted ceiling that forced her to stoop near the window, keeping his accounts, minding his younger children, and hearing, almost daily, some version of the same complaint, that she ate without earning her keep, that a young woman ought to be married off and made another man's expense, that she had inherited her father's strange stubbornness without his usefulness. Her aunt, a thin and anxious woman named Cordelia, who deferred to her husband in all things, treated Adeline with a distant, careful courtesy, the sort one might extend to a boarder whose rent was uncertain, and the younger cousins, sensing early on that their father regarded their orphaned relation as an inconvenience, mirrored his coolness without quite understanding why. Adeline kept the granary's ledgers with a precision Ezra Pruitt privately relied upon and never once acknowledged, balancing his accounts late into the evening by a single tallow candle he begrudged her the cost of. And she mended his children's clothes with her mother's old sewing kit, and she asked for nothing beyond the narrow room and the food set before her. She bore it the way her father had taught her to bear difficulty, without complaint, waiting for the ground beneath her to steady. It never did. On a gray morning in early spring, 3 weeks past her 19th birthday, Ezra Pruitt called her into his office at the back of the granary, did not ask her to sit, and told her in the flat tone of a man closing an account that he could no longer justify her keep, that she was of age, and that she would need to make her own way in the world. He set $9 on the desk, the sum, he explained, of what remained after subtracting 2 years of board from a small policy her father had left behind. She did not argue. She had learned there was no arguing with a ledger. She took the money, gathered the little that was hers, 2 dresses, her mother's sewing kit, her father's set of masonry tools wrapped in oilcloth, and his old canvas notebook of well depths and soil readings, and she walked out of Millbrook Hollow without looking back. She traveled west for 3 weeks, first by wagon, then by rail as far as her money allowed, then on foot along wagon ruts through country that grew drier and more open with every mile, the green hills of Missouri giving way to the pale grass and endless sky of the Wyoming territory. She had no plan beyond survival, no destination beyond wherever the road happened to end. And it ended, finally, in a settlement called Sable Creek, a town of perhaps 30 buildings strung along a single dusty street, backed by low brown hills and watered, or so it seemed from a distance, by a creek that gave the town its name. She arrived with $3.40 in her pocket, dust in the seams of her one good dress, and the particular hollow-eyed determination of someone who has run out of any option except forward. The town, when she walked its length, told its own story before anyone spoke a word to her. The buildings were sound but tired, several storefronts boarded. The water trough outside the livery cracked and dry, and the creek itself, when she found it at the edge of town, ran thin and brown over its stones, barely ankle deep even in what should have been the wet season. She learned soon enough why. A rancher named Cornelius Vance, who had arrived in the valley some 12 years prior with money from somewhere back east, had over the previous decade quietly acquired the upstream water rights along nearly every tributary that fed Sable Creek, diverting the flow through a system of ditches and small dams onto his own spreading acres, leaving the town and the smaller homesteads downstream to make do with whatever trickled past his gates. It was, everyone agreed in low voices, entirely legal, or legal enough that no judge had yet said otherwise. And so the town had adjusted itself around the slow strangulation of its water, the way a body adjusts around an old injury, with a limp nobody mentioned anymore. Asterisk. Adeline found the land office at the far end of the street, a narrow building with a faded sign, and inside it a thin, ink-stained clerk named Harlan Abernathy, who looked up at her over a pair of wire spectacles with the weary patience of a man who had answered the same desperate question too many times to count. She told him plainly that she had almost no money and needed land, any land, that she could work. Abernathy gave a short laugh at that, not unkindly, and told her that every parcel with water on it in 20 miles had long since been claimed or bought by Vance's agents, and that what remained was worthless scrub nobody would take even as a gift. Adeline, who had inherited more from her father than a set of masonry tools, asked whether worthless scrub included anything with a well on it, because a well, unlike a creek, could not be diverted by a man upstream. Abernathy paused at that, studied her for a long moment, and said there was in fact one such place, the old Callaway Ranch, 4 miles north along the dry wash, abandoned for 11 years since Jeremiah Callaway had vanished from the county without explanation. Its taxes long since forfeited, its buildings collapsing, its well presumed dry like every other water source in the valley since Vance's dams went up. The county, Abernathy said, would be glad to be rid of the liability. He could release the deed to her for the cost of the filing, which came to $1. Adeline set the coin on his desk without hesitation and walked out with a piece of paper naming her the owner of 160 acres and a ruin, the Callaway Ranch, sat in a shallow bowl of land between 2 low ridges, exactly as bleak as Abernathy had promised. The house was a modest 2-room structure of gray, weathered lumber, its porch roof sagging, its windows either broken or boarded, and the barn beside it had partially collapsed into a heap of silvered timber that the wind had been slowly scattering for over a decade. The corral fence lay in pieces. Tumbleweed and sage had reclaimed what had once, judging by the faint furrows still visible in the earth, been cultivated fields. But it was the well that drew Adeline's attention first and held it longest. A neat circle of fitted fieldstone rising 2 feet from the ground, perhaps 30 paces from the house, capped with a warped wooden lid that had partially rotted through. She recognized the workmanship immediately, the careful selection of stone, the patient interlocking of shapes without mortar, the same discipline her father had practiced and taught her. Whoever Jeremiah Callaway had been, he had built this well the way a man builds something meant to outlast him. She spent her first hours simply walking the property in the fading afternoon light, reading the land the way her father had taught her, noting where the soil darkened near the old dry creek bed, where the fields had once caught runoff, where the house's stone foundation, despite the ruin above it, remained solid and true. The bones of the place were good. It was like so much else in her life, broken but not beyond repair, and she found in that thought a strange, steadying comfort. She set her small bundle of belongings inside the door of the house, claiming it, and turned her attention immediately to water, because her father's oldest lesson had been that a person could survive without a roof, but not without a well, The next morning she found a length of rotted rope and a rusted bucket in the ruin of the barn. And she set about clearing the well the way she had watched her father clear dozens of neglected wells over the years, lowering the bucket, hauling up load after load of windblown dirt, dead leaves, and small stones that had fallen through the broken lid over a decade of neglect. It was slow, aching work, the muscles of her back and arms burning by midday, but she did not stop, because stopping meant admitting defeat before she had truly begun. By late afternoon the bucket, on one of its final descents, came up dragging something unexpected, a fragment of rotted wood, and beneath it. When she lowered the bucket again and worked it carefully along the well wall, a section of stone that shifted at her tugging, grating loose from where it had settled at an angle for years. Curiosity overtook her exhaustion. She worked the loosened stone free with patient effort, easing it down into the well's depths rather than risk it falling and cracking whatever lay beneath. And when she finally hauled the bucket up one last time before dusk, it was heavier than it had any right to be. Inside, wrapped in a section of oiled canvas that had kept the worst of the damp at bay, was a bundle bound tightly with waxed cord. Adeline carried it to the porch steps, sat down in the last orange light of the day, and with trembling fingers worked the cord loose. Within the oiled cloth she found two things: a small leather pouch, heavier than its size suggested, and a folded packet of papers, yellowed but legible, protected from a decade of damp by the careful wrapping. She opened the pouch first and found a modest sum of coin, not a fortune, but more than she had held in her hands since leaving Millbrook Hollow. Enough, she understood immediately, to buy tools and seed and the beginnings of a life. But it was the papers that made her breath catch, because the topmost sheet, written in a careful, urgent hand, was a letter. To whoever finds this. It began, "My name is Jeremiah Calloway, and if you are reading these words, then I did not return to reclaim what I have hidden. And you have found your way to a well I built with my own hands in the spring of 1873. The letter went on to explain, in the plain, unhurried language of a man setting his affairs in order, that he had settled this valley alongside 4 other families in the years before Cornelius Vance arrived, that the 5 homesteads had shared the creek's water fairly and without dispute for nearly a decade, and that everything had changed when Vance began quietly buying up the water rights on the tributaries above them, one small claim at a time, through agents who never mentioned his name. By the time the town understood what was happening, Vance held rights to nearly every drop of water that fed Sable Creek before it ever reached the valley floor. And he had begun, subtly at first and then with less and less subtlety, to squeeze the remaining homesteaders towards selling him their land at prices that grew crueler each season. The creek ran thinner. Calloway wrote that he alone among the 5 families had refused to sell, because his well, unlike his neighbors' shallow surface wells, ran deep enough to reach a spring aquifer that Vance's diversions could never touch, and because he possessed something the others did not, an original territorial water claim, filed the year he arrived, that predated every one of Vance's purchases and that, by the plain language of territorial law, granted his homestead senior rights to a share of the creek's flow regardless of what lay upstream. He had gone, he wrote, to consult a circuit judge in the county seat about formally asserting that claim on behalf of the whole valley, only to return and find his barn burned and an unmistakable message left in its ashes. Frightened for his life and unwilling to risk it further, he had hidden the deed and what money he had in the well he trusted more than any bank or law book, intending to return with the judge's help once matters cooled. He never had the chance. The letter ended simply, "I do not know if I will come back to this place. If you have found this, you are standing on land with water that no one can rightfully take from you, and perhaps, if you are the kind of person who digs a well rather than walks past a dry one, you will finish what I could not." Beneath the letter lay the second document, a formal territorial water claim dated 1873, sealed and witnessed, granting the Callaway homestead senior appropriation rights to a specific, generous share of Sable Creek's flow. Adeline sat on the porch step long after the sun had gone down, the papers in her lap, understanding with a slow and settling clarity that she was no longer simply the owner of a ruined ranch. She was the keeper of a claim that could, if honored, unravel a decade of quiet theft and restore water to an entire valley of struggling families. Herself now among them. Over the following days, Adeline moved through Sable Creek with a purpose that had been entirely absent when she first arrived. She bought lumber and nails from the town's small mill, run by a broad, sawdust-bearded man named Otis Kemp, who eyed her with open skepticism until she asked, correctly, for straight-grain cedar, suitable for shingles, and explained she meant to re-roof and re-brace the old Callaway place herself. Kemp, who had known Jeremiah Callaway years before, and had never quite believed the man simply vanished of his own accord, softened at the name and threw in a bundle of scrapboards at no charge, muttering that the old ranch had been waiting a long time for somebody with sense enough to see it. She purchased flour, beans, salt pork, and a small cast-iron skillet from the general store, and she spent her evenings in the half-repaired house working by lamplight, not on the roof, but on the letter and the claim, cross-referencing what Callaway had written against county water records that the ever-helpful clerk Harlan Abernathy, once she explained her discovery in careful confidence, allowed her to examine, asterisk. What she found confirmed everything. Vance's earliest purchases of upstream water rights dated to 1876, 3 full years after Callaway's original claim had been filed and witnessed. Under the plain doctrine every territory out here had adopted, first in time meant first in right, and a senior claim, properly asserted, took precedence over every junior appropriation made afterward, regardless of how much land or money the junior claimant had since acquired. Callaway's forgotten deed was not merely a curiosity from a vanished man's past. It was, if Adeline understood the law correctly, and Abernathy confirmed that she did, a legal instrument capable of forcing Cornelius Vance to release water he had spent 12 years treating as his own. She did not act rashly. She spent nearly 3 weeks quietly rebuilding the physical evidence of her claim to the land itself, clearing the well fully, repairing the roof plank by plank with the froe and mallet her father had taught her to use, mending the corral, and planting a modest garden in the dark soil near the old creek bed, all while making careful, unhurried inquiries about the nearest circuit judge and the proper procedure for formally asserting a senior water right before the territorial land office. It was during this quiet period that Sable Creek began, cautiously, to notice her. A widow named Margaret Yoder, whose small homestead lay 2 miles east and whose creek allotment had shrunk to almost nothing over the years, rode over one afternoon with a jar of preserves and stayed to help Adeline mend fence, the two of them working in the easy silence of shared labor. Otis Kemp began setting aside good cuttings of lumber whenever she came to town. Even the town's quiet sheriff, a deliberate man named Caleb Whitfield, who had watched Vance's slow consolidation of the valley for years with visible unease, but no legal grounds to intervene, took to riding past the Callaway place once a week, never dismounting, simply asking if all was well and nodding when she said it was. A small unspoken acknowledgement that she belonged there. It was inevitable that Cornelius Vance would hear that someone had taken up residence on the old Callaway place. And inevitable, too, that he would come to see for himself what manner of person had settled on land he had long assumed would simply crumble back into the earth unclaimed. He arrived on a gray afternoon in early summer, mounted on a fine dark horse, flanked by 2 of his hired men. And he did not dismount either, looking down at Adeline from the saddle with the polite, appraising coldness of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He introduced himself with unnecessary formality. remarked that he was surprised the county had released the deed to anyone, and offered, in the same breath, to buy the property from her outright for a sum that was on its face generous for 160 acres of supposedly worthless scrub. Adeline understood immediately what the offer really was: an attempt to erase the Calloway claim before anyone thought to examine it. She declined politely, saying only that she had just begun to make the place her home and was not inclined to sell. Vance's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went flat and careful, and he told her, in a voice still perfectly civil, that a young woman alone in this country would find life easier with money in her pocket than pride in her chest, and that his offer would not remain open indefinitely. Then he turned his horse and rode away, and Adeline stood watching him go with the certain knowledge that she had just been measured, and that the measuring was not finished. The pressure that followed was subtle at first, the particular kind of pressure available to a man who owned half the valley's commerce without ever needing to raise his voice. The freight company that had once agreed to haul her lumber suddenly found itself unable to spare a wagon. A hand she had arranged to hire for the corral repairs failed to appear, and later admitted, shamefaced, that he had been quietly warned off. Prices at the general store, for her purchases alone, crept upward. Adeline bore each obstacle the way she had learned to bear all difficulty, without complaint, adjusting her plans, hauling her own lumber, doing the corral work herself even when it took twice as long. But when a section of her newly mended fence was found deliberately torn down one morning, the rails scattered and one of Margaret Yoder's borrowed goats gone missing into the hills, she understood that the message being sent to her was the same message once sent to Jeremiah Calloway in the ashes of his barn, delivered this time with slightly more restraint, but unmistakably the same warning. She did not frighten as easily as perhaps Vance expected. That night, by lamplight, she wrote out a careful, detailed account of everything she had found: the letter, the claim, the dates of Vance's purchases against the date of Calloway's filing, and the pattern of pressure that had followed her simple refusal to sell. And the next morning she rode the 4 miles into Sable Creek, not to the land office this time, but to the small telegraph station, from which she sent a message to the circuit judge in the county seat requesting an urgent hearing regarding a senior water appropriation claim on the Calloway homestead. She followed this by quietly informing Harlan Abernathy, Otis Kemp, Margaret Yoder, and Sheriff Whitfield, one by one and in confidence, of exactly what she had found in the well and what it meant for every homestead in the valley whose water Vance had been slowly strangling for over a decade. Word, once it began to move, moved quickly and quietly through Sable Creek, the way water finds its way downhill. And by the time the circuit judge arrived 3 weeks later, a dozen families whose creek allotments had shrunk, year after year, under Vance's dams were prepared to stand alongside Adeline Marsh and testify to exactly what those years of scarcity had cost them. The hearing was held in the modest front room of the land office, crowded well past its intended capacity with homesteaders who had never expected to see the matter of the valley's water addressed in their lifetimes. Cornelius Vance arrived with a lawyer from the county seat and an expression of confident irritation, clearly expecting the whole affair to be dismissed as the fanciful claim of a friendless young woman with no standing to challenge a man of his position. He was visibly unsettled when Judge Averill Coates, a spare, deliberate man with little patience for theatrics, examined the original 1873 claim, cross-referenced it without hurry against the county's own water rights ledger, and confirmed aloud, for the whole crowded room to hear, that the Calloway appropriation predated every purchase Vance had made in the valley by no fewer than 3 years, and that under the plain and long-established doctrine of prior appropriation, the senior claim stood, regardless of who now held the junior rights or how extensively he had built upon them. Vance's lawyer argued, with a lawyer's practiced desperation, that the claim had lain dormant and unasserted for over a decade and ought to be considered abandoned. But Adeline, when given leave to speak, read aloud from Jeremiah Calloway's letter, describing the burned barn and the fear that had driven him to hide the deed rather than risk his life asserting it. And the room fell entirely silent at the plain, unembellished account of what it had cost one honest man to try to do the right thing 12 years before. Judge Coates ruled, in the end, that a claim suppressed by demonstrated intimidation could not be considered voluntarily abandoned, and he ordered the senior appropriation fully restored and enforced, granting the Calloway homestead, and through it the whole valley's downstream users under the established, sharing customs the 5 original families had once observed, their rightful share of Sable Creek's flow, with Vance's upstream diversions to be adjusted. Accordingly, under the court's continuing oversight, the restoration did not happen overnight. But within a season, the creek that ran past, Sable Creek's main street, carried water at a depth no one under 30 years old had ever seen it hold. And the dry, cracked trough outside the livery filled for the first time in a decade. Vance, stripped of the quiet leverage his water monopoly had given him over the valley's other ranchers, found his influence over the town's commerce evaporating nearly as quickly as his dams had once made the creek evaporate. And within 2 years he had sold his remaining holdings and left the territory altogether, a fact the town remarked upon without much sorrow. Adeline used the modest sum of coin Jeremiah Calloway had left in the well, along with the first 2 seasons' proceeds from her own restored garden and pasture, not to enrich herself beyond her needs, but to help Otis Kemp rebuild a proper mill dam that served the whole town rather than one man's fields, and to help Margaret Yoder and 3 other struggling homesteads dig their own supplementary wells, guided by the same careful stonework her father had taught her, so that no single point of failure could ever again leave the valley thirsting at one man's whim. In the second spring, after she had arrived with $3.40 to her name, Adeline Marsh sat on the porch she had rebuilt with her own hands, the well beside her house drawing sweet cold water for a corral full of goats, and a garden thick with young potatoes and greens. And she thought, as she often did in quiet moments, of the 2 men who had shaped the life she now lived, though they had never known each other, and one of them she had never even met. Her father had given her the patient, careful knowledge of stone and water that let her see a broken well not as a ruin, but as a puzzle worth solving. Jeremiah Calloway, a stranger whose fear had once driven him to hide his hope in the one place he trusted more than any bank, had given her the means and the cause to finish what he could not. She thought, too, of her uncle Ezra Pruitt, who had once set $9 on a desk and called it a settled account, believing her a burden with no value beyond what could be measured in coin, never imagining that the girl he cast out with almost nothing would one day restore water and dignity to an entire valley from a well he would never see. Adeline Marsh had been 19 years old, orphaned and broke, when she took over a deserted ranch that had been given away for free because no one believed it was worth anything at all. It was, in the end, the most valuable thing she ever received, not because of the coin hidden in its well, but because it had asked her to look at something everyone else had already written off, and to see, instead of ruin, the patient shape of something waiting to be finished. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Adeline's story tonight. If a tale like this one moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things are not always worthless things. And we would love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us, if you can, has there ever been a moment in your own life when you looked past what everyone else had given up on and found something worth saving there? We read every single comment, and we are always glad to know where in the world you are joining us from. Until next time, stay close and take good care of the quiet, overlooked corners of your own life. They may be holding more than you think. *.